Welcome to This Explainer. Today we are immersing ourselves in the grim, unforgettable reality of late 1916. We're going to step directly into the boots of an average World War I soldier for a story of survival, staggering logistics, and truly unimaginable endurance.
Okay, let's dive into this. Right off the bat, I want you to instantly drop any romanticized ideas of warfare you might have. We are landing right in the freezing, waterlogged trenches of 1916, tracing the footsteps of an everyday soldier facing some of the most hellish conditions humanity has ever engineered. The contrast here is just extreme. Our subject today is Albert Fletcher. Everyone called him Bertie. Back in 1914, he was a 19-year-old shopkeeper in Liverpool who literally jumped at the chance to fight. Fast forward just 2 years to 1916, and at 21, he is a battle-hardened, physically and mentally scarred veteran. The brutal nature of industrial warfare aged these young men at a terrifying speed. Part 1. Meet the Tommy. Let's do a quick flashback to see exactly how Bertie ended up deep in the muck. When the call for volunteers went out, Bertie actually considered joining the Royal Navy. But he opted for the Army because the idea of being stuck in a metal tin can, bobbing along in the ocean, just didn't appeal to him. This brings us to a massively consequential moment. After waiting in a recruitment line for hours, Bertie enthusiastically signed his enlistment oath. He agreed to serve for 3 years, or the duration of the war, whichever was longer. At the time, he was completely unaware of the horrifying endurance test he was actually signing up for. To get to the front, you had to pass the medics. Bertie easily passed his medical examination to join the King's Liverpool Regiment. He was 19, 5'9", with good teeth and vision, so he ticked all the boxes. But it's definitely worth noting that in the chaotic early days of the war, recruitment offices were so overwhelmed that they passed a lot of unfit men for military service anyway. Part 2. Tools of the Trade. Let's bring our focus back to 1916 and look at the actual survival gear keeping Bertie alive. Discipline and strict training turned civilians into soldiers, sure, but they needed the right equipment. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer mechanical advantage the British possessed. The British SMLE Mark III weighed about 8 3/4 pounds and held 10 rounds of .303 caliber ammunition in a detachable magazine. That is double the capacity of the German Mauser. This incredible workhorse gave the British a massive firepower advantage. And that firepower advantage resulted in this absolutely astounding number. A trained Tommy could unleash 20 aimed shots per minute. This devastating barrage became known as the Mad Minute. The rate of fire was so intensely rapid, in fact, the Germans often mistook units of British riflemen for concentrated machine gun fire. But a soldier is a lot more than just his rifle. The physical burden of a Tommy's essential kit was immense. We're talking the 1908 pattern webbing, a 17-inch bayonet, an entrenching tool, a gas mask, and the steel Brodie helmet introduced in 1915. But honestly, items like puttees and dry socks were just as crucial as a functioning weapon. You absolutely needed them to prevent the dreaded trench foot, which was a crippling condition caused by the constant moisture of the battlefield. Part 3. The Trench Network. After the initial scramble of the war, an incredibly extensive system of muddy trenches was carved into the earth, stretching all the way from the coast of Belgium down to the border of Switzerland. These weren't just simple ditches. They were a layered defensive system connected by communication trenches. Ideally, soldiers wouldn't stay in one spot. They were supposed to rotate from the firing trench, back to the support trench, and finally to the reserve trench every 4 to 7 days. However, as any veteran would tell you, on the Western Front, conditions were rarely ideal. Because the British believed in launching just one more offensive to end the war, their trenches were often poorly drained and quite temporary compared to German defenses, hence the vital need for duckboards to keep soldiers from completely sinking. But wooden planks couldn't mask the awful sensory details of this environment. The constant, exhaustive battle against the mud, the ever-present giant rats, and the horrific stench of unburied bodies. Part 4. The Waiting Game. Despite this horrifying, apocalyptic setting, actual combat was surprisingly sporadic. When you weren't actively fighting for your life or repairing a collapsed trench wall, a soldier's primary, creeping enemy was actually the crushing weight of boredom. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly how they passed the time. The strict, monotonous daily routine of trench life started with the morning stand-to prepare for a potential attack, followed by breakfast, which was usually some dubious tinned beef, and weapon inspections. Then came trench repairs,
endless afternoon boredom, and finally another stand-to at dusk. So, to combat the mind-numbing boredom of those dugout afternoons, soldiers wrote letters. A staggering 12 million letters were sent back home every single week. Bertie himself wrote hundreds of them to his parents back in Liverpool, desperately clinging to a piece of his old life.
Part 5. The constant threat. We have to abruptly pivot the tone here, because the illusion of a quiet afternoon writing letters could shatter in a single violent instant. The threat of enemy assault, infiltration, or worst of all, a sudden gas attack was a constant looming shadow.
Just months prior to our 1916 snapshot, Bertie's regiment was fed into the absolute meat grinder of the Battle of the Somme. Tens of thousands of British soldiers died on the very first day. Bertie actually survived a shrapnel wound to his shoulder and arm. He was sent to an aid station, bandaged up, and incredibly, sent immediately back to the front line, while the sounds of machine gun fire still echoed in his mind. Which brings us to this critical question. What happens when the sun goes down? If you think nighttime offered some relief or a chance to sleep, you are mistaken. Night brought the terrifying, deadly necessity of crawling out of the relative safety of the trenches, completely exposed in pitch-black no-man's land, just to restring the barbed wire defenses. As Bertie finally settles in for a few hours of restless sleep in the dugout, we are brought right back to this haunting motif. France is being bled white, Russia is teetering on the edge, the end seems impossibly out of reach. As he remembers his enlistment oath, whichever was longer, it forces us to ask, beyond the mud and the machine guns, how long can the human mind truly endure when the horizon offers absolutely no end in sight?